Um, Hello, good afternoon. Got a full house again, which is great. Welcome to another Transmediale panel. My name is Jussi Parikka. Our panel, Read, Write, Modify. I've got the pleasure of moderating this session and I'm hosting our conversation with our wonderful speakers. What I'll do is a brief introduction to the theme, after which I'll introduce our speakers. We got two speakers in the room and two speakers online, and we'll be, I'll explain a bit more soon what we'll be doing. Our focus is on narrative in the expanded sense. We are interested in language as much as the infrastructures where language connects. We track such instances where language itself becomes an infrastructure that by describing and inscribing sets the tone for a horizon of feelings, emotions, affects, and actions. Hence, reading, writing, modifying become fundamental operations of world making and world unmaking, sustaining existing worlds, reproducing their given preferences, but also rewriting and modifying with the right tools at hand, or the right tools that need to be invented for the situation at hand. We don't focus only on natural language, as we engage with digital environments of code, where agency takes different twists and turns. The automation of capacities of speaking and acting would be one such example of digital aesthetics, one of bots, virtual assistants, and other alternative animations of life. The structuring logic of databases would be another. Narrative and language have played a central role, to say the least, in colonial knowledge, both as data-driven logic of archives and categorization of things that puts things into their place, and the stories, factual and fictional, that sequenced who speaks, where and when, with what voice, if any. As Amitav Ghosh has recently written, like many also before him, colonial narrative language was for a long period not just a matter of privileged positions, but also the underlying operation of racialized muting that left much of the human world without a voice. It did much the same to the ecological world as well. To state the obvious, things considered mute and inert are not so. As decades of feminist, post-colonial and decolonial theory and critical post-humanities have pointed out carefully. This, of course, has many implications for the broader continuum between ecological justice and techniques for making visible and audible what might otherwise be left out. So today we engage with many artistic and literary approaches that articulate not only worlds that exist, but ways of modifying this space with creative intent to rewrite and modify in historical contexts of current and past imaginaries. The expertise of the panel is vast and includes the capacity to shift between fabulations and instruments of scale, to the fine-tuned ways of engaging with images, digital aesthetics, literary strategies, and performance, and you'll get a really nice sense of all kinds of approaches and practices. Our panel is structured into 3 rounds, broadly based on questions I set out in advance that I'll get back to and I'll voice them later. These questions are loose versions of read, write, modify, as they ask our speakers to both elaborate on their practice and their current research and articulate its relation to the shared set of concerns around narrative, scale, colonial legacies, and of course, digital culture. At the end, we'll have time for questions from the audience, that is, you people. And I think we have some kind of way of also getting questions from online, but I don't know how, but I'll figure it out as we go along. Before we jump into our first question and start the rounds, I want to introduce our speakers. I'll do it briefly. You'll find the longer bios online as well, but to get obviously a warm welcome to our speakers. Sria Chatterjee is an art historian and environmental humanities scholar with a PhD from Princeton University. Sria specializes in political ecologies of art and design from colonial to the contemporary. She's head of research and learning at the Paul Mellon Center in London, and where she leads the multi-year climate and colonialism research project. And in 2020, and I'm sure many of you have seen the project as well, she founded and led the award-winning digital project Visualizing the Virus. Online, we have Ali Akbar Mehta is a transmedia artist, curator, researcher, and writer who's today, hi Ali, who's today zooming in, or actually it's not Zoom, but other platform, coming in from Helsinki by examining, Ali, by examining narratives drawn from zones of conflict and dominant power structures. His works foreground overlooked bodies, data networks, and ecologies, asking how can artistic imagination affect politics of power, violence, and justice. Also, I want to add that Ali is, I'm glad to collaborate with Ali on the Helsinki Biennial. We're both on the curatorial team for that as well. Alexandra Sasha Anikina is a filmmaker, researcher, and media artist who completed her PhD at Goldsmiths in London. She teaches at Winchester School of Art as one, and until recently was also the Bolzan postdoctoral fellow at Sorbonne Nouvelle University in Paris. Sasha's work with experimental film, game engine art, and lecture performances have been featured internationally, and the list is long. She was also the co-curator of Impact 2018 Algorithmic Superstructures. And also online, welcome is Rindon Johnson. Rindon Johnson is an artist and poet based in Berlin. Obviously, you're now kind of with an online connection with us. I'm glad you're joining this way. Based in Berlin, but born on the unceded territories of the Ohlone people, he has worked extensively on questions of language. Presented solo exhibitions also at multiple places, including in Chisholm Gallery in London, Sculpture Centre, Long Island City, and so forth, plus also multiple group exhibitions in really great venues. Rindon is also the author of Nobody Sleeps Better Than White People, the virtual reality book Meet in the Corner, also Shade the King, and The Law of Large Numbers, Black Sonic Abyss. Warm welcome also, Rindon. So now, let's get into I'll hand it over soon to our speakers. And as said, we'll do rounds. We'll do the rounds in the order of Sria, Ali, Sasha, and then Rindon. And they all been asked to, in a way, respond and articulate some of these. And these shouldn't be seen as too tight questions, but like a couple of prompts that I wrote. First of the prompts was basically this. Each of you deal with particular history or histories in your work, one that includes multiple storylines, so to speak, and complex relations with the contemporary moment. Could you start by elaborating this starting point so as to set the scene and so that we can follow up with how it relates to the general theme of scale? So, Sria, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me? Yes.
Welcome.
Okay, great. No? Yes. Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks, Jussi, also for the introduction. And I think you mentioned already that I'm an art historian, though I actually don't know if I like being called that, but I am. So I've been trained in art history and also work with on environmental topics with some focus on history of science as well. And I think in terms of your question, I think a lot about disciplines and the making of disciplines. And you were sort of talking about narrative and how the way that we make our worlds is really relevant for the contemporary moment. And I think really thinking, so my work connects the colonial to the contemporary, but really also thinks about this kind of the long 19th century, not just as a moment where it's an imperial kind of colonialist moment, but it's also when knowledge is coagulating. It's when most of the kind of disciplines that we have at university are founded. And it's also when like the other is sort of articulated, both in terms of the natural world, but also ethnographically, the kind of distinction between and the construction of whiteness. So I think it's really, I find it quite helpful in my work to think through the formation of disciplines just as much as, you know, kind of the way we write art history or the way we write literary criticism, etc. And I think going back to this question of scale as well, and thinking about, as Gabriel Hecht talks about, the multi-scalar perspective and thinking about scale as, well, multi-scalars scale, not just as something that is multi-scalar between like humans and non-humans, but also on epistemological modes. So like how we construct knowledge, like that's another scale that I think I really want to bring into discussions. Part of your question also asked about like projects and practices. So I think my practice is very, so I write, and I also, I'm a researcher, and at the Paul Mellon Center, I run a kind of range of programs, but a research project that Jussi mentioned is the Climate and Colonialism Project. Maybe I can talk about it a little bit, because it relates to this question also of making visible, but and these longer connections to the contemporary. So, I mean, really the current climate and ecological crisis has deep roots in colonial history, and so the project really tries to think through these roots, but also how we make visible. And like a lot of work has been done on images and how we see, but also questions of what has been erased and what we don't see, and the capacity of images to obscure as much as they reveal, I think, is something that we're really interested in. I think just to give an example, in 2019, The Guardian published an article, I suppose, on how they were how they use climate images and what it means to use climate images, and they like had this thing about how they didn't want to use just images of, you know, like a fire or some, but they really wanted to use human faces and human suffering, which is great, but also like I think it speaks to the fact that like images have a lot of sort of currency, and they really change how you feel and act as well. But if you think about the fact that, okay, if you're talking about a flood or a wildfire, you see a moment in crisis, and you see something, even whether it's a moment of human suffering or if it's like a forest burning down. But what you don't see is all the kind of structural and long-term processes that are behind it. So both historical as well as like all the kind of implications, whether it's corporate or nationalist, or all the many things that are behind this. So I think in a way also as kind of both art historians or visual theorists, as well as, you know, sort of people working with data and so on, how these connections are made visible and how the conversations and the narratives around these conversations happen is something that I'm really interested in. Also, this project is really interested in, so come join us in whatever way is possible as well. So.
Lovely. And we'll get back to that actually probably soon as well. Thank you. Let's move on to Ali. I think there's lots of kind of a really interesting connections. Ali.
Yes. Firstly, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I think we do. Yeah.
All right, super. Yeah, I think there's a lot to kind of riff off from what Sria just spoke about right now. I mean, specifically, just the question of the discipline, and a lot of my own practice as an artist and researcher has been to work with archives. And I've been working with archives in different formulations and different yeah, in project-oriented specifics for the last for the last 12 to 15 years. A lot of them are community archive making and community archive building, but a lot have to do with the question of violence, and violence as kind of articulated by a Norwegian philosopher and theorist, Johan Galtung, where he articulates violence in the context of direct structural and cultural violence, so tangible, intangible, and then also, as Sriya spoke about, those kind of offshoots and long term effects, which are often invisible but also invisibilized. And in that sense, when working with archives as a uh, as a system or a mode of infrastructure through which knowledge can be articulated and understood, both as an artistic practice, but also in a way a non-artistic or a beyond artistic practice kind of orientation. Um, just thinking about archives through the idea of interdisciplinarity, or this idea that Anne Francois Smith talks about complex objects. Complex objects are those objects whose properties are distributed in unprecedented ways across interdisciplinary forms of knowledge and cannot be completely explained by a single discipline. So, if we think about archives as as a complex or a contemporary object whose structural, infrastructural, and content understandings are properly situated in an interdisciplinary format, then what does it mean for archival practices, and especially what does it mean, at least the question that I'm interested in, what does it mean in the sense that what can archives do then within artistic practices, and what new relations are required to be formed across social, economic, political, ecological, technological, and aesthetic dimensions of knowledges for a comprehensive understanding of both archives and ourselves, both in a human and non-human and beyond human contexts. And um, yeah, so this was just specifically kind of responding to what Sria was talking about in the sense of discipline, and can interdisciplinarity also be a discipline of its own uh, in a modified sense. And the question of scale then also enters into my work, where by its very nature the idea of violence, by being a kind of a global or a universal constant, in a sense, how do then narratives and experiences as data and information be explained or extrapolated or even expressed through specific contextualizations and projects. That's one of the things that I've been thinking about in a lot of different ways, and a project that I've been working or and okay, another thing is that when one is then working with archives, and especially ongoing archival structures which are digital or situated in digital domains, they often become unending ongoing projects. And so what then does it mean for projects to actually have that open-ended lifespan, where complex archival objects can be actually articulated but also understood by the users, by the audiences, in multiple ongoing and constantly changing ways. So there's another kind of an aspect of scale that then comes in through experience as well. I
Yeah.
don't know if I've over kind of shot my time, but yeah.
If you ask me, you never do that. So we will love listening to you. We'll get back to those questions about archives and get a sample of your work in a while. But now I'm going to hand it over to Sasha, please.
Thank you. Great to be here. I'm gonna share some slides, so if you could put them up, it would be very nice. So, in relation to your question, I'm gonna answer it from inside one particular project that I'm doing right now, so as opposed to speaking from my general practice. But for the context, the project is called Procedural Animism, the Trouble of Imagining a Socialist AI, and it's a title of a recent paper that I just published in Akbar, which is a great journal produced by Transmediale Workshop. And it's also part of my artistic work in development and part of a book on procedural images, which is tackling operational images, but in relation to kind of critical post-humanities and affect. And so maybe the reason why I think this project is a good idea, is a good start of talking about reading, writing, and modifying, because it has to do with the question of figuration. And before actually maybe saying a few words on what procedural animism is, I want to say a basic premise for the project, which is a problem of how we imagine and anthropomorphize technologies in general. And my argument is basically that there are very many different opacities, ambiguities, strange things that appear when we think about algorithmic agencies. I'm I'll try not to use so many air quotes in this talk, but please bear with me. But the argument is basically that precisely the ambiguity between how they seem and how they operate makes them a very powerful political tool for monetization or for public perception. And the one big consequence of that is if we get AIs that are figured in particular ways, in anthropocentric, in colonial ways, then we also get politics that are figured by them instead, which are also similar in their colonial scope. And to underline the issue with ambiguity, I'm not saying that we don't know where the agency comes from. Yeah, we know which companies produce which technologies, and we know who generally stands behind some projects. But I'm saying that precisely because of that, we tend to overlook the agency and ambiguity. And great example of this is this chatbot on Twitter in 2016, which went very fast, very wrong. Hundreds of news headlines followed which said racist chatbot, a racist anti-Semitic robot, and not a racist engineer name or a racist company name. Yeah, and in the company statement which followed this beautiful experiment, the rhetoric further lays blame at the door of AI. So you can see it's coordinated attack by a subset of people who exploited, tweeted, vulnerability was exposed by the attacks. It's a very strong language, which doesn't really give much responsibility to the company, but rather to the public and to the bot. So the perception of such artifacts as autonomous, I'm saying, is really a big part of life, and it's only going to become bigger. And it has far-reaching consequences towards how our politics are figured by these ambiguous agencies. But what I'm more curious about, maybe in relation to narratives, is kind of imaginaries and figurations and the processes by which the interactions between these bots and other artificial so-called entities are producing different type of political worlding. And the intuition is that, yes, it's informed by very many popular culture and sci-fi narratives, by mainstream narratives saying, typifying them into particular categories, but they're not really reducible to those. And there's a much broader cultural, everyday relations-based understanding of how we relate to such things. And in relation to, yeah, so here's even you can see how if we don't figure these AIs, they will be figured for us. Yeah, outside of critically minded figurations, what we have are these conjured commercial spirits, basically, that get reinstated within the tropes that capitalism presents to all others, even non-human ones. Plus, it's kind of an important aspect of this, I think, is that all of these relations are primarily channeled through images, yeah, and it's the images that become these portals through which we constitute our relationality to these bots. And also, these images then ultimately, in the end, become the sort of exert a sort of gentrification of the political through the visual. And in regards to the scale and kind of history of histories, or what kind of scope I come from to this, it's not just a theory of or history of rhetorical obfuscation and misdirection, but it's more about how these categories of humans are constructed, right? So if following the decolonial understanding of how we approach others, we might just extend it far enough to include algorithmic others. And then following post-colonial theorists like Walter Mignolo and Sylvia Winter, we can then imagine how these non-human outlines, which are usually backwards and barbaric, constitute a normative humanness. So that's, of course, not a very new also field, and it owes a lot to decolonial AI, to feminist studies of science and technologies, and to other alternative imaginaries. So this is where I'm coming from, basically the theories that already explore the boundary productively between the human and the non-human.
Wonderful, thank you. Many things that we will return to. We'll move on to Rindon online. Let's have you back on screen. Just a second. We are. Yes. Rindon, it's all yours.
Hey,
Hi.
hi. Thank you all for having me. It's been wonderful hearing about everybody's practices. And I think I was kind of not at a loss necessarily about how to begin the process of talking about scale in relation to my work, mostly because I sort of started with a lot of I don't want to put myself down, but like vaguely naive thoughts about what language is and is not, and sort of wondering sort of why it felt as though the moment that we name something, we shut it down. And then I realized, of course, that naming was a form of control. And of course, linguistically, the way that we sort of attempt to categorize things, we begin to shut down those sort of important meanings of it, which are intangible and impossible to fully define. And I kind of got into these questions about 7 or 8 years ago when I started viewing live streams of American national parks. And in particular, I got obsessed with this live stream of bears in Katmai National Park. And I kind of realized that there was a very intense form of surveillance going on that was completely non-consensual from the bear's perspective. And I started to think about what a live stream really was. And as the pandemic kind of set in, I found myself back again on the live streams, and I started working on this other project that I think maybe sort of began a conversation with kind of global scale in the rest of my practice. And I'll just go ahead and share my screen here to show you some stills from this. But basically, I heard somehow in that time period, I heard an Iranian proverb that is the dog is the brother of the fox. And I thought that that was a nice way to describe some things that scared me and confused me about being a person online who was capable of basically surveilling all of these spaces that at some moments had humans and some moments did not have humans inside of them. And depending on which part of the planet you were in, was full or not full. And I thought that there was this very confusing impulse that seemed to exist the world over of self-surveilling. And so, wait, let's see. Can I share? Is this going to work? So, can you all see this? Can you all see this still?
We just got the
Yeah.
thumbnail, small one, but like it's not enlarged yet.
Okay, wait, hang on. Sorry about that. We'll try again. So, there we go. So basically, I started recording kind of endlessly as much as I could from numerous locations around the world, and I cut it together into a pretty short film. But now, of course, I have these hard drives and hard drives full of days of time. And it felt weird to kind of arbitrarily choose mornings, evenings, this place, that place. But it got me very much interested in this idea of why it was that I could, just in my desire to record, suddenly own this thing and call it mine. And I added on top of this kind of poem that was switching subject object through each sentence. Yeah, I think there was also this very kind of wordless intensity that I also wanted to speak to, kind of undoing the thing that I was very much interested in, which is like, what do we call this? And it's almost like maybe we can't call it anything. So I don't know. That's kind of a little introduction. Uh, yeah.
Great, thank you. We'll return to these topics soon. Um, I want to follow up on something that might sound obvious to the audience, but and because this was already mentioned, the C word, colonialism. Colonialism repeats in different ways in your projects, as you just stated. With the specificity that you bring into play due to those histories, Could you continue with this note on how you work with and beyond this legacy and its contemporary manifestations? This moment when we are sandwiched between the persistence of histories and emergence of new forms of neo-colonialism as well, and how does that come across in your projects? Sria.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, I'll show you some slides, but before that, just to kind of reiterate what you've already said, you see that, I mean, the colonial project is in many ways an enduring one, and we find that happen in, sort of show up in different ways. And I think, yeah, I like to think, or a lot of people have been thinking about it as well as in its like most expanded sense. So not as something that happened in the past and, is finished, but more so as a set of ongoing relations and repercussions that are both sort of geopolitical and biological and also political, right? So, so kind of just to lay the ground. And also, we're not post-colonial. I think that if you think about that as a period in time, that's something, but has the colonial ended? No, right? So I think one example, this is part of something that I'm writing at the moment, and like my favorite thing to talk about. So one example that I think I thought I could take you through is this material called gutta percha, or India rubber, as you might have come across it. And this is really like this purified, coagulated latex that's obtained from palanquin gutta trees, which are primarily grown in Southeast Asia. And in the 1840s, gutta percha was found to be like a useful natural thermoplastic, which really revolutionized global communications in the 19th century. So here's some images as well. It was used to insulate underwater cables. So what you see there is one of them. And these are underwater telegraph cables, right? So after the first successful international cable was laid in 1851, communication networks developed quickly and the demand for gutta percha really escalated. And they were grown in areas such as Borneo and Sarawak, which, as you probably know, were part of the British Empire in the 19th century. So we go back to this last image, where you can see that the latex was not easy to collect or locate. And so they were very much dependent on indigenous collectors who had the knowledge and skill that was required to bring it from the forest for trade to the outside world. The other problem was that there was no sustainable way to collect the latex. So the tree needed to be felled first, which is what you see over there, and then incisions were made into the bark. So this meant that the whole enterprise was not only dangerous and difficult, but also unsustainable for the ecosystem. And so I'll take you to... So gutta percha, unlike other colonial commercial ventures, was not part of the plantation system of production, so it exists in like a slightly different politics. But having said that, the tree was sort of disappearing very quickly, like it disappeared from Singapore by 1857 and was disappearing elsewhere, causing like huge damage to rainforests and ecosystems, as well as sort of people around them. So although it wasn't reliant on the plantation economy, indigenous communities were used by elite landowners and merchants and became kind of sucked into the global market system that ballooned and shrank as British conservation mandates came down on the conservation, air quotes, of gutta trees. And other more efficient means of extracting sap were developed. And that, again, set into motion its own destructive trail. Right, but the British raced ahead of other European powers in submarine telegraphy in the 19th century, thanks largely to its monopoly on gutta percha. This is, whoops, not yet. In some sense, it was this sort of thick black, sort of tactile substance that really facilitated the modern militarized global world because of the underwater telegraph cables and like really kickstarting the communication systems. But let's cut very quickly to this image, which is New York in 2015. And what you see here is a fiber optic cable as it snakes along the ocean floor in the Caribbean, strangled by algae and tapped by the NSA. This is an image by a photograph by Trevor Paglen, and it's one in a series built around the NSA scandal and the surveillance state. So many of these undersea routes were identified for submarine telegraphy and have continued to be applied with new types of data, carrying ever denser streams of data as well. So really to think about what the longer connections are between, something that was very much a sort of colonial pursuit of finding a natural thermoplastic, how that, in some sense, modernizes and militarizes the world, and what of course, since then, the use of coal and oil to make plastic has completely changed what we use in undersea cables. Whole different neo-colonial sort of history there. But I think it's really trying to make those connections between the fact that what we have here now and the kind of current surveillance state, it is very much built on these longer connections and these longer histories, which are imperial and kind of expanding histories, as it were. And I think this takes us back to your work, you see, as well, in terms of media and media infrastructures as well. So I think just going back to scale and thinking about erasure and accountability in Paglen's photos, or some of the work that a lot of artists are doing to make visible. So it is useful in some sense to know that both erasure and accountability are happening at multiple scales. So ending on a hopeful note.
Thank you. Let's move online. Next up is, can we get Ali on screen again?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi.
So to you, Ali.
Yeah. I mean, just thinking about in this context, thinking about language as a form of epistemic violence, and then also thinking about knowledge in within institutional and infrastructural practices as a way of having been institutionalized as politics of knowledge, knowledge economies, power knowledge relations, specifically as a productive force for biopolitical expansion. And thinking about also the whole idea of specifically in my context, speaking about archives, that institutional legacy archives have been sites of segregation, of racialization, and immobilization of communities. The data of archives, deeply entangled in power and violence, are the foundations of our knowledge societies. And although archive-based practices in contemporary art practices have a tendency to cherry pick stories that can be read against the grain, a structural overhaul of archival rules and system logic is essential to transform archives into politically conscious knowledge systems. And in this sense, I'm also thinking about what Sasha spoke about earlier when she was talking about AI and that one particular experiment. That when we think about AI and digital online, even algorithmic systems, uh, and then when we are thinking about algorithmic bias, we are often not taking into account that those biases are actually formed through human bias. And so, when thinking about the relationship of archives and its users, um, as a relationship of actually, I mean, the relationship between archives and users is in a way that there is a certain kind of a performative relationship in in the fact that when we as users and developers and um, archivists, in a more expanded sense, that today we are living in a archival time, that we are all archivers and life loggers of our own stories and our own narratives. In that sense, when we are generating our archives, there is a certain kind of human bias that is ingrained into the algorithm, into the data, into the narrative. And then in turn, when archives inform us, they do so with an algorithmic bias that actually is. So there's a certain kind of circularity and a feedback loop. There's a certain kind of a cybernetic relationship between us and the knowledges that we structure and consume. So that kind of online performativity is something that I've been very interested in, and this online performativity very directly has roots in colonial architectures and colonial structuring of how archives were constructed, how knowledge is constructed, and especially in a certain kind of institutional environment that right now I'm doing my doctoral studies, that becomes very, very clear and very apparent how a certain kind of legacy of institution of colonial narratives and colonial information structures actually are passed down in forms of epistemic violences. But just to maybe catch up a little and speak through a project, I'll just quickly share my screen. And this one particular project called 250, I don't know, can you see my
Not
screen?
yet, but
Ah,
do we have
right.
it?
I have to.
No, unfortunately, we don't have it. No,
Yes,
for some
yes, yes,
reason
yes.
it's
One second.
not
I have
sharing
to
the
just
right
switch
ones, but let's see.
on. No?
No, for some reason we're not getting your screen, unfortunately.
Okay. All
Right.
right, never mind.
It's just
So it's the second device, but okay. So the project is called 256 Million Colors of Violence, and it basically began with a particular event that happened in India in 2008 called the Malegaon bomb blasts, which when they occurred, they very quickly were assumed to be the work of extremist Muslim student organizations.
uh, yes. Now
Here
I
we go.
got your image as well.
Yes,
Continue. Yeah.
yes. So this is what the website looks like. So, just to kind of get back to the introduction very quickly, that it was the work, the bomb blasts were assumed to have been done by extremist militant student groups, but very quickly, when investigations ensued, it revealed the existence of a Hindu terror network, which was previously, before this particular bomb blast and the investigations, not known to the authorities. And so, in an address to the police commissioners, the home minister of the country at the time, Mr. Chidambaram, made a comment saying that we must beware of saffron terror. And this particular context, or this particular statement is very volatile for two reasons. One, that in a country like India, the cultural narrative and the representation of the two major religions, Hinduism and Islam, is primarily done through Hinduism being associated with the color saffron and Islam being associated with the color green. And so there was a huge backlash where a lot of people um, even made police cases saying that their sentiments have been hurt and then this is offensive to them. Even people from Chidambaram's own political party condemned the statement, saying that there is no color of violence, or if there is a color of terrorism, it's black. And so this particular project actually takes that idea, that statement, and turns it on its head, saying that there is a color of violence, but perhaps it is unique to each individual's own lived experience. So how to then map an individual's own lived experience in a way that it kind of coincides or articulates with their idea of what a color of violence could mean. So basically, the project is essentially a series of 50 questionnaires. I'll just if you could share the screen. Yes. So if you kind of go into the participate mode, the first thing you have to do is put in your name and your email, and through this, basically, the project in a way is able to communicate with you. The questions in this essentially are around 50 questions that are sourced from existing survey questionnaires from from various governments, corporations. Uh, if you want to open a new Facebook account, a Gmail account, if you want to do anything with the bank, or open a bank account, so on and so forth. And the idea with this is that through this survey questionnaire, the project in a way is attempting to sensitize the participant to the existence of violence that occurs in their everyday setting. So why is, for example, why is something like, for example, race a form of violence? So there is a certain kind of an explanation towards that. One of the things that I often talk about is or skin tone. I mean, and then where does the idea of skin based segregation actually come from? So a certain idea of the 23 colors of the Fitzpatrick scale, or what we now very familiar with, the von Dushin scale, in the form of the emoji colors. So these are all basically racial science or race science outcomes of decades and decades of practice. A lot of it that has been happening in the last of 200-300 years. Um, or for example, in any kind of a bureaucratic form, you the idea of gender is basically male, female, and if one is lucky, you get a third option, which is other. But the UN Human Rights Commission recognizes 67 different forms of gender. Sorry, slip of tongue. So in the project, one is also kind of looking at a gender as being specifically or specifically different from sexual orientation. So then one has that kind of a option as well. And so in the entire formulation, it's not just enough to kind of give these options as what a certain aspect of your identity can be, but also in a way try and explain to those uninitiated what these terminologies can actually mean. So through this way, what the project is also doing is that within the questionnaire there is an archive of information that is embedded. So one is not only simply saying that, okay, we are going to take your information as what a bureaucratic or a institutional survey questionnaire would do. There is not just a one-way flow of information, but one is saying that, okay, we are requesting information from you, but we are also providing information in return. So in that sense, creating an encounter of equals. And the last question in the survey questionnaire is what, according to you, is the color of violence, and if you can explain your choice of color. And this is essentially a Photoshop style color picker, which gives you 256 million colors as an option. So to go back to the homepage and just show you um, these colors. So these are basically all colors selected by participants over the course of the last um, 7 to 8 years. And so what the project actually is trying to do is that it's trying to uh, generate through this a kind of a digital networked performance, a performance between individual participants and the system. So there's a certain kind of a relationship between system and agent, where the idea here is a certain kind of a sensitization towards what your idea of identity is, what
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
composite identity actually
Yeah.
is composed of, and
Shall we?
in kind of then being confronted with what you are, you're also simultaneously being confronted with what you are not, but what other people are.
Yeah.
And so this kind of a relationship of sensitization, and then finally kind of um, uh, this kind of in a way a realization from the participants themselves as to what the nature of reality and the nature of violence can mean in a more expanded structural
Yeah.
context.
Yeah. Thank you. In the interest of time, let's Sasha.
If we could go back to my slides, please. From the same point where they ended would be nice. So returning to, I'm very happy, Ali, you mentioned the biopolitics and the epistemic violence, because this is exactly where I'm picking up. So, and returning to the question of procedural animism in relation to its participation in colonial and neo-colonial rethinking or navigation, let's call it like that. On some level, referring to animism, no slides yet? No. Let me know when there are. So in some, in some sense, I just can say that I refer to the recent turn towards animism as an alternative, as an alternative politics and as alternative relationalities. And this has been noticeable in recent anthropology, for example, in work of Eduardo Kohn, How Forests Think. So this is a kind of understandable term, but of course it's very worth addressing the fact that animism is a very colonial term with a very violent history of formulating and framing epistemic notions of other ontologies or other worlds as kind of inscribed in colonial logics. So in this, I'm really very much inspired by work of Elizabeth Povinelli on geontologies, and she herself doesn't use the term animism. She says, she calls it analytics of existence when she talks about indigenous life words. And she says that basically animism becomes a controlling mechanism, right? When something is called animist in a Western discourse, it becomes appropriated as something that was pre-formatted for the late liberal markets. And she calls it, what I really like, this phrase, figural tactics of late liberalism. So in following her, I'm kind of situating procedural animism also as this figural tactics. So on the one hand, it makes visible this kind of colonial structures. On the other hand, there is still a very large, I believe, personally, procedure kind of desire to connect to other things. Yeah, there is this desire to return to some kind of alternative political imaginary. So in my thinking, procedural animism essentially emerges as two things. One is a multiplanar set of symptoms of the contemporary condition, yet symptom of impoverishment of experience, this movement towards bare life, of alienation, of kind of marginalization of everything that is other, which only continues to increase in different ways. On the other hand, it's also an individual practice of acknowledging other things and also refusing to reduce them to something or refusing to instrumentalize them, right? And in this sense, it's also a practice of resistance to capture and alienation. But one very important part of this consideration is actually, for me, again, drawing from the work of Elizabeth Povinelli, is going a bit further in relational politics than just thinking about AI as algorithmic other, because it doesn't solve completely all problems, right? And it just leaves us basically where we are at, like here, or all of our others, and algorithmic also with them. But it's kind of nested for me in larger questions of borders being drawn between life and non-life. And this is what Povinelli talks about in her book. Yeah, she produces a critique of biopolitics, which, as she says, is a necessary concept from which this investigation of governance and control starts. Control over the body and the living body. But then she also says that it requires maybe also thinking what a life is in the first place. Yeah, what is life and what is non-life? And What is particularly relevant to algorithmic governmentality in this sense is exactly this default categorization of technology in the category of non-life, which paradoxically allows it to do two things simultaneously. One, that technology is seen as a mere tool, so it kind of passes by unnoticed in terms of agency, and the other one, it also can become then figured and agentified, and this is like the part that I'm interested in, yeah, that it's agentified in particular ways. And the animist relationality in this sense seems to be affected by both of these things, because algorithms exert the governance over the subjects, right? But it's almost impossible for us to relate to them without figuring them in some way. So there's this particular relation in which procedural animism attends to the liveness, sorry for the air quotes, of these things, and it attends to the representational qualities, yeah, and to the liveness with which they act within the image economy, for example. And there's a kind of a spectral personhood at play there, where we have animist agency that emerges out of ambiguity of bureaucratic/governing procedures, because they simultaneously kind of encapsulate this expenditure of life into labor, in energy, and access to rights. And at the same time, they foreclose the humanity of what is being robotized. So it's a double-edged sword. And procedurality in itself also obliterates every difference, because once something is inscribed in the procedure, it's not really a difference anymore in any meaningful sense, yeah? And if it's outside, then it's excluded and othered again. So, in other words, yeah, just to wrap up this part, the separation of life and non-life firmly seems to place the algorithms into the latter, but since they also effectuate governance, this technological existence creates this field of procedural spectrality. I haven't found a word for it yet. It's a kind of a politics of alterity where we both have humans which are becoming robotized by performing microtasks and bots who are fulfilling human representations, figured in a human way, figured in particular aesthetics. So in this sense, I think in task of decolonizing the current AI, this is a very important question. And there are many also great scholars writing about this, like Jennifer Rhee, for example, Bogna Konyer, that in order to attend to this process of dehumanization, we have to attend to both sides or both directions of dehumanization, from the bot side and from the human side.
Thank you. We'll go back online. We get Rindon. Rindon, it's all yours.
Hey, I guess to kind of pick up everybody's threads a little bit, I want to talk about like this piece that I made in 2021 that kind of began my interest in something that I've just been calling speculative animation. The work is called Coeval Proposition Number 2, Last Year's Atlantic, or You Look Really Good, You Look Like You Pretended Like Nothing Ever Happened, or A Weakening. And the work kind of began out of my realization that I had a show in London and a show in New York, and that since the show was supposed to be the same show, actually the exhibition was in the middle of the ocean. And of course, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, basically between New York and London, is the North Atlantic cold blob, which ostensibly is the cold water from the Greenland ice sheet collecting, and that cold water eventually will be the mass of water, the blob, that will stop the Gulf Stream from going. And of course, stopping the Gulf Stream has incredible kind of unfathomable, wild impacts for the entire planet. We don't really fully even understand what the Gulf Stream does. We know certain things take it. We know that it is incredibly important, but we don't really fully understand what its purpose is in our giant ecosystem. And so what I did is I took all of the data from the year 2020 and I took it from the NOAA weather archives, ostensibly, and then I ran it back through the video game sorry, it's late here, through Unreal Engine 4. And basically, what that allowed me to do was to visualize the entire year through the way that it had been observed in this archive. And of course, it's an interesting thing, right? Because the NOAA data is coming from basically all the ships that are crossing the Atlantic. And some of that data is sent automatically, and some of that data is literally put in by hand by a single person. And so when someone rates what the sunset looked like on that particular day or that particular point in time, there's this moment where they have to decide, was it like a 8 cloudy or was it a 7 cloudy? And in those moments, you kind of had this odd kind of flattening of this one moment of subjectness in like suddenly becoming this objective thing. And I found that an interesting moment when I'm trying to make this like 365-day piece that is both a record of the time and simultaneously it is impossible to record that time. And it's also impossible to even understand what it would look like to be at the North Atlantic cold block for an entire year. So yeah, I think, I don't know, what lives inside this work, of course, is questions about kind of like what the North Atlantic Ocean holds inside of it, the history of that space, the triangle trade, of course, which intersects with my own identity as a Black American person, but then of course the very nowness of it as we are like currently watching our planet fall into a totally different ecological moment. And then, of course, the kind of future possibilities of that space. And this is like a record holding thing. Yeah.
Wonderful. I can see so many interesting links emerging around the topics you've been mentioning. Thirdly, so let's return to modify. Let's return to the topic of modify and the question of scale. I believe that in one way or another, all of your projects present a case for alternative timelines as well, alternative futures even, imagining, narrating, presenting in different ways. Can you elaborate on your different approaches to data and digital techniques in this context? I think you already gave us glimpses in terms of how data features perhaps there. How do these methods and practices work with and move beyond narrative? What's the sort of like relations between your practice, narrative, data, digital culture? Quite a kind of very narrow question, I can, but Sria.
Yeah, can I show not
Yeah.
this, but this
Yes.
thing? Yeah, thanks, Jussi. And also, I think I'm going to very obliquely answer your question because I'm not really going to talk about data, but maybe the limits of it to some degree, and think back to what Ali was saying about archives, and also to Sasha's point about biopolitics and so on. So this, and we'll look just quickly at this digital project called Visualizing the Virus, which I started with a small group of dedicated colleagues in 2020 with a small grant actually from Daria. And the idea behind the project was really to think about the fact that, COVID is, well, not COVID, but like the coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2 virus itself is invisible. And so, of course, there were scientists at the time like drawing and making it visible in different ways, but also the pandemic made a lot of structural inequalities visible that were otherwise invisible. So also like really thinking about what it means to make visible felt like a really political question at the time. And this really was a pandemic project. Like we were all locked up and quite like sad as well. But a lot of there was a lot of misinformation. There was a lot of information and misinformation. It was a very particular moment. It actually feels like a long time ago, although it wasn't. It was just 3 years ago. And so the idea of having a digital project, and it grew organically. All to say that this started in 2020 and actually finished in 2022. So and it exists kind of as an archive, but the idea was to make connections and to provide a sort of a digital architecture that is quite curated, and it was but collectively curated. So we'd invite people to write things and then curate clusters. And then each, and I'm sorry I can't really show you because this isn't online, but once you go into a particular, say, essay, you'll find that every essay is tagged with multiple things, and then each tag then takes you to another cluster, which is not curated, but like humanly tagged, so it's not, so we go in and tag articles. So in some sense, it's a sort of experiment also to like a curatorial experiment. But the idea really was to connect up things that were happening in different places. So for instance, you would have something like this curated cluster on waste, or on pandemic dwelling and so on, which brings together things from different places. But at the same time, there was another cluster, say, on zoonotic disease, and a particular essay on bats would also talk about care or labor and things like that. And so how does that connect with other things that talk about care and labor? So really making those connections and making visible how these connections are important. So I think that was, but not algorithmically. It's a very curated project. But I think some of the thinking behind it was also how do you make sort of marginalized stories visible, and where does that come from? And again, like this, I think is never a project that can succeed, in the sense that you cannot. Like our reach was only that much. We sort of advertised and said like we want things. We didn't have very much funding as well. So again, like I think it's important to think about the limits of what you can do to sort of make visible as well, and kind of accept the fact that whatever you're doing is only that much, but doesn't like ever present a complete picture. So even when like there's a cluster on COVID denialism, there's kind of various clusters that point to things, but then they only go that far. So yeah, and come back to.
Oh, it is a wonderful example. Let's continue in the interest of time. Ali, your brief notes on the final, quote unquote, final question.
Right. Well, yeah, maybe quickly to share my screen, and I can also
Yep.
just speak over. This project, or this publication that I made called Wallace Codex, part of a larger project called War Room Echo. And in a way, it started in it started through various reasons, and all of that is perhaps not important, but at some point of time I kind of arrived at this idea or this knowledge that there is no comprehensive um, list or documentation or archive of conflicts in the world, that it is often broken up into geopolitical locations, into civilizational models, into time periods, and so that information or that knowledge is kind of fragmented in different ways. So this project actually began as a way to document, just as a list, all battles, wars, sacks, sieges, revolts, revolutions, bombing, insurgencies, now also including protests and revolutions. Sorry, I already said revolutions, protests, and insurgencies from 5400 BC to, from 3500 BC to the present. So this 5423 plus year archive, in a way, was something that I felt was also important to kind of just put out in its volume. And of course, the way that the project, or the way I imagined the project to kind of proceed, was a kind of a performance between two people in a dark room, which is also then surrounded by a drawing that I was planning to make. And this, in a way, is a 3D visualization of what I kind of imagined the performance and the installation to look like. Of course, it hasn't happened yet, but this archive exists, and this archive I've been using as a kind of a script for performance readings for the last 7 8 years. Just reading these conflicts for hours at an end, anything between an hour to 5 days. The entire list kind of takes 21 days to read in its entirety. So the idea also that this kind of information, or this kind of archival dissemination, as something that is articulated in a very emotional register as a form of remembrance, as a form of deterrence, as a kind of what Rindon said, a kind of a speculative imagination or a speculative animation of future of futures. Another project, quickly to just talk about, is called Purgatory Edit. It kind of starts with it takes as its starting point Clockwork Orange's very famous aversion therapy called the Ludovico method. And what one kind of started with was a kind of, I'll just quickly show a video again, um, just to kind of play on the. So project is sorry the project is again an archive of all moving images sourced from archival footage, cinema, news clips, home videos, so on and so forth, of moving images that are dealing with the representation of violence and conflict in our histories. And basically the idea with the project is to use a brainware and and we're working with neuroscience. So okay, let me not get ahead. So we are basically we have been collecting, me and my team have been collecting these clips for the last 1 year, editing them, processing them, and then just tagging them with a certain kind of violence intensity and mapping them. And the idea is to kind of use it, and this is a test video. So the video is actually generated through a person who's wearing a brainware device, like a portable EEG device, and based on the emotions that are generated through looking at these footages, it kind of creates a juxtaposition of future clips to be played. So in a way that if you're feeling stressed or relaxed or angry or sad, it basically then shows you the next video and the next video and the next video. So also kind of playing with this idea of montage, to create these long form videos, um, uh, and kind of look at this kind of idea of a relationship between war and peace, or conflict and peace, and utopia and dystopia, of looking at this kind of a relationship between proclivity and phobia, so on and so forth. um, and this is basically a project. Okay, I'm going to stop this. But basically, this is a project that one is kind of been looking at, where the idea between the list, or the wall list that I spoke about, and this project, and the 256 million colors of violence, in a way, one is also trying to create works that simultaneously bear witness to our fragmentation. And this idea of bearing witness to violence transitions an individual from the personal act of seeing to adopting a more public, ethical, and political collective stance,
Yeah.
where they can then work through trauma together.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
bearing witness is not merely to narrate, but also to commit oneself and the narrative to others, to take responsibility for histories or for the truths of occurrences. And
yeah.
in a way, it's an appeal to
We
community
might need
building.
to we might need to move on soon. So, to in the
Yeah,
interest
so
of time,
that's just, yeah,
do
that
you
was
want to
my
have
last
one
thing.
final sentence? Okay. Yeah. But
Yeah, yeah,
hopefully, we'll have time to return to those questions. Thank
sure,
you
sure.
very much.
Yes.
Sasha.
Yes, I still have some slides left, a few remaining ones. So perhaps there are two things that I would like to address in relation to methodologies of these future future imaginaries, yeah, or how do we approach the figurations and narratives in AI sphere, but also outside of it, I guess. And one of them is so given we have afforded technology this category of non-life, and we said the word agency. And then the word agency immediately asks us, so what does it actually mean that this such thing has agency beyond just looking alive, or beyond just empowering some kind of effect in us or some kind of emotion? And if we really consider this as alterity politics, how then they can be really mobilized, yeah, and how they can be emancipated to do something different. And secondly, maybe the question is also then, once we have this, does it scale? Should it be scaled? And what prevents it from being scaled? I'm going to show you two examples of these AI figures, which I think make a perfect case of a difference between a decorative sense of agency and the operational sense of agency. So one is, maybe you've seen this beautiful robot called Ida, who appeared in front of the UK's House of Lords Committee on Communication, I believe, and presented itself as a speaker from the face of technology to actually talk about the danger that something technological might seem human. So that's how they framed it in the beginning. And she's called Ida after Ada Lovelace. She's presented as a product of collaboration of many researchers and many artists and designers. Yet, when we look at her again, there are some details which I think bear a lot of interest to what kind of agency we can talk about. Well, first, she's figured, of course, as a recent London art graduate. And in previous pictures, she also is shown wearing a blouse with spots of paint on it. The company that produced her hardware is called Engineered Arts, a company commercially producing humanoid robots, especially for the TV series Westworld. The undergraduate students, Salah Al-Abd and Ziad Abbas, developed her drawing arm, the machine vision and drawing algorithms, and they were working on their own time while they were studying. It's not clear if they were recompensated. I hope they were for that. And finally, some of the earlier articles cite Aidan Meller, who is the mastermind behind this robot, saying that his gallery sold more than $1 million worth of Ida's artworks. So she's a perfect example in terms of it's really a she, not it, yeah, in this case, of figural tactics in late capitalism, because even the description on the website summarizes this capitalism conundrum between being put between critical AI discourses and the necessity to sell art, because they underline that when we talk about Ida as artist and her artwork, we do with full acknowledgement of her machine status, while simultaneously developing her artist persona, which I find really, really interesting. An alternative example for that is also maybe a work that some of you know, Synthetic Messenger by Tega Brain and Sam Levine, which is a botnet that clicked, I'm saying this because it stopped working in favor of not accumulating carbon footprint, which is very good, also ethical consideration. So the botnet was looking for articles which had climate change as a topic and clicked on all of the advertisements, inside each article, therefore making each climate change article way more profitable for the media outlet than hopefully before. And you can see the difference in these agencies, in fact that Synthetic Messenger, of course, kind of inserts itself into the domain of life as a political agent, yeah, as something that can act and operate in the contemporary epistemics. And kind of returning to scale, I want to tackle the question that I didn't answer with calling my article The Trouble of Imagining a Socialist AI, because I don't really want to imagine socialist AI, because that would mean me answering a question, what is socialism? So for the purposes of this talk, socialism is just some kind of alternative future post-capitalist condition or alternative political imaginary. But the word socialist in this sense is not chosen randomly. I think it's a very interesting word because it's colored by a particular version of a loss of belief. And this kind of space where we have to imagine something, yeah, and we think that it's something that's related to animism or something irrational, and like the word esoteric, immediately your brain goes, this is not really, I should not touch this. And I think this is one of the interesting dangers of this, because then we're being put in pre-existing frameworks, yeah, and it's very easy to fall into popular narratives of AI as well. And I don't have a solution, but I have a slight intuition for this. How to imagine an alternative AI is maybe to think about not what is it like to be a bat, right? But start thinking about the world in which such bat or AI could become possible. So start with world in first, and then maybe describe a political formation in which something is possible, and then proceed to the figuration itself. Thanks.
Fantastic. We'll go back online with Rindon. Let's get you up there. Rindon, hello again. It's all yours.
Hi. Yeah, wow, sorry, I'm still digesting everything you said, Sasha. I really enjoyed that and thinking with you about that. And I guess what I will do is kind of show my own fool's errand, which is a work that I made in collaboration with the artist Jacqueline Kiyomi Gork, that basically stems from my own very selfish and absurd desire to see through the eyes of a Cuvier's beaked whale. And of course, like that's just saying like how a whale sees is like such a funny and absurd conceit in the first place, because whales don't see the way that humans see, but we do understand in the research that we have on their eyes that we know that they see in black and white. We know that they see in this long panorama that almost, I think it's like 245 degrees, and we can ostensibly with Unreal Engine 4, one of my main tools, we can recreate what it means to see as though you were a whale. But of course, then what Jackie, my collaborator, then had to do was kind of come up with a proxy way to deal with the sonic landscape. And of course, there is no way for us to understand as humans what it would feel like to be a whale in the ocean doing anything. But I thought it might be kind of fascinating to sort of ask Jackie to go on that process and then meanwhile create a first person hunting game where you as the player have to try and hunt a squid. And the way the Cuvier's beaked whales hunt is they work in collaboration. So basically, two whales have to sync up together, and then they throw their voices around the ocean, confusing the squid, and then they can catch the squid. And so, of course, in this fool's errand of a game, that's what you're trying to do. But what it looks like and what it feels like is this kind of like slow, like completely different shift about how to move through space and how to like try and get something. So yeah, so I don't know. I think I kind of have started putting in more of these game spaces in my practice to kind of play out these speculations and questions and kind of these, I don't know, errands of fool's errands of data collection and then visualization, and sort of being like how absurd to think that we could ever do this, and yet here we are capable of doing this. So yeah, anyways, that's just to round it out. That's just a little project of mine.
And a wonderful project it is. Thank you so much. We have very limited time, but I still want to open up to questions. So anyone with burning questions, we do have time. I want to say we have time for about 2 questions. So please, audience, it's all yours. I want to, while you're thinking about, just raise your hand as one usually does when you want to ask a question. While you're doing that, there's so many links, but they're on so many levels as well in terms of circulation of images and words and the ways in which particular performative and other practices can relate to it as well. There's something really interesting in all of your papers about proxies, in a way relating to also what a bit earlier Bobby Pietrusco was in a very different case study talking about, but I'm just still wanting to prefer to give it the word to the audience. Otherwise, is there a question? It's sort of like half a question. Yeah, of course. Yeah. We need to get your mic. Yes.
Hello. Thanks very much, everyone. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about visual culture and the shift from John Berger's ways of seeing to computer vision and what that means for us collectively, but in a pedagogical sense as well. Thank you.
So a small question then.
Yeah, amazing. Who wants to jump in? I know that you have thoughts, that's for sure, but who wants to jump in? 3.
I have many thoughts, and I think trying to condense it is going to be hard. But I think in some sense we are at a moment where we're really rethinking how we see, right? And it was interesting just to see Rindon's video of like thinking about perception, the non-human perception, which includes sort of computer vision as well as sort of animal perception, etc. It's just opened our sort of spectrum of seeing to so many levels, which I think, Berger was groundbreaking at the time. And I just feel like we're at a moment where we need to kind of also think collectively and collaboratively about how we see and what we make visible, because it is an interdisciplinary question now. It isn't really, you're not looking at one image, or even just one image and a set of political relations. You are really thinking about multiple ways of seeing and really kind of engineered ways of seeing as well. So.
Maybe I can add very briefly to that I completely agree with it's an ethical question of what to show and what to make visible rather than how also to see. But in relation to John Berger, his was a critique of representation and relied so much on just making something represented and then it's understood what we think about it. Now we have to work, at least from my point of view, with the imaginary. So now we have to deal with the critique of the imaginary, which is a bit more difficult, than not difficult, but it's a bit more multi-layered and not so obvious than the critique of representation. So,
excellent. Do either one of you, Rindon or Ali, want to briefly jump in? Rindon, yes. Can we get Rindon?
Yeah, I have like a kind of anecdotal response to that, in that I now like very rarely do any sketches. I mostly put everything through Midjourney, which is like a kind of the counterpart to DALL-E. It's a slightly stronger visual AI. And of course, what I've found in that process is that anytime that I write a person or a family or a group of people, that person is always a white person, and always very stereotypically European-ish looking. And so I have to be very clear and specific about if I want a person of color to be visualized in any of the work that I'm rendering through this AI. So it's like, in some ways, this question of like this collaborative moment of like, how do we do this? It's actually quite urgent, and it's already begun to slip into the continual reproduction of particular forms of supremacy.
There's lots there. Ali, do you want to have a really brief final words?
Yes, very quickly. I mean, two things come to mind immediately. One is this book called Object Oriented Feminism, that in its introduction talks about the way in which AI and machine learning is designed to understand and uh, understand image through the metadata and tags provided, and what kind of complications arise from, say, for example, searching for something like bunny and then actually having for images of women, and that kind of a relationship in a very xenofeminist kind of a context, and being problematized through that kind of a line of thinking. So where and how does our way of seeing actually change in the contemporary moment, which, being part two of my answer, is marked by a flattening of history in an expanded sense, that we're no longer in a way looking at an art history which is a linear history of isms, but in a way is looking at everything simultaneously as a contemporary object, a contemporary artifact.
Thank you, Ali. What I propose next is, because we're running out of time, is that please do continue discussion and come and talk to our speakers after the panel, or get in touch. I'm sure they are very kind of happy to engage in conversation, both with Ali and Rindon as well. But one more time, let's really warmly thank our speakers. Wonderful talks. Amazing. Thank you, everyone, and audience.
And thank you, Jussi.